items. First of all, this is the first of several calls that are going to be going on in the next week or two for candidates who have sought Twin Cities DSA's endorsement. You can see the others that have been scheduled at the link I just posted in the chat, which is our events page. We've got a pretty packed agenda. We had hoped to spread these out a little bit more, but of course, events in the Twin Cities rarely listen to us in the way things go. So we've had to shuffle the schedule a little bit, but encourage folks to check into as many of these as possible. This is your opportunity to ask questions of our candidates directly and have that more direct dialogue as part of our process that we're hoping is very participatory and democratic and open to the membership. So this is the Q&A part of it. The next step after the various Q&As is going to be when the steering will schedule a big endorsement meeting for all the candidates that they schedule, where we will again hear from the candidates all in one sitting and have member debate. There will be opportunities for discussion and debate via Slack, all throughout this process, but this will be a big opportunity for very structured contemporaneous debate that I encourage folks to participate in that. And then after that session, there will be a OPA vote online ballot emailed to every member that will ask you to basically, for each candidate, say whether or not you think we should, as Twin Cities DSA, endorse this candidate. The threshold is 60%, and it's a form of STV vote. So for each candidate, each race is considered individually. So for some elections, there's multiple candidates seeking endorsement, so they kind of go head to head. And you can also select no endorsement. For those races where it's just one candidate, it's just them versus no endorsement. So that's the process to come. I am going to dive into the business very shortly. And as a reminder, we are recording, so please be aware of that. And so this will be made available to members who were not able to attend the call. So again, let me just introduce myself. I'm John Grill. I go by he or they. I am an organizer with Twin Cities DSA's electoral committee. And we are joined here today by Robin Wansley, who is running for Minneapolis Ward 2 City Council. And so I will turn it over to Robin now to introduce herself, and then I will ask her some of the initial questions submitted by folks using the forum.
Yes, thanks, John, and thanks everyone for joining tonight. Just a little bit about myself. I'm Robin Wansley Wallaby. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a Chicago native, a current Cedar Riverside resident. I'm also a Democratic Socialist, a scholar, currently doing my PhD at the University of Minnesota, a community activist with our teachers union, as well as a labor organizer and workers' rights champion. And I'm running to represent Ward 2 in our city because I've experienced many of the same struggles and injustices that thousands of our city residents experience daily. That means I know what it's like to work full time and still struggle to pay your rent and cover your basic necessities. I know what it's like to be unemployed and in need of public assistance to get through desperate times. And one too many times, I've watched my own loved ones and neighbors be harassed and targeted by police officers. And it's these very experiences that motivated me to fight alongside workers, specifically our workers, for a 15 minimum wage. It's these experiences that constantly move me to show up on the front lines when our community has been attacked by MPD officers, especially when we've lost our community members to police violence, such as Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, George Floyd, and most recently, Daunte Wright. And it's why I continue to show up with our communities and build movements to fight back and end police brutality and fight for a new vision and mandate of public safety that works for all of us. And as an elected leader, I plan to continue building those movements and organizing alongside our grassroots coalitions of workers, students, homeowners, and community organizations around efforts that's going to make our city truly equitable, affordable, and just. And for our campaign, that means fighting for bold and fundamental changes like rent control, universal housing, public safety beyond policing, and attacks on the rich. So I look forward to diving more into why we are stepping into this historic moment in our city and asking you to support us as we build for a new vision for Minneapolis with our campaign.
Thank you very much, Robin. So I will ask the first question, and again, for folks, if you want to, we'll open it up to the audience in a bit after I've asked a couple of the questions submitted earlier, and again, use the Q&A function to set those up. So first question that we've got is a question about what are 3 major policy gains that we would gain from you over the Ward 2 current incumbent?
As I shared a little bit in the intro, the 3 biggest pieces of our campaign or the priorities of our campaign is around universal housing, because we know that more than 50% of residents in our ward are not only renters, but they also make less than $35,000 a year. So many of them are living in cost burdened housing or have been even pushed out of housing in our communities. So universal housing and supporting efforts like rent control, TOPA, things that we have stood in solidarity and organized with housing justice advocates for a number of years prior to CAM supporting these measures. We will wholeheartedly fight for those things. The next measure is around public safety beyond policing. We are not proponents of mediocre police reforms that's going to just mandate additional trainings. Our campaign is really about pushing for substantial overhauls and transformations of our public safety system that make sure that we have a quality and equitable public program around public safety. And that means we need to disarm them. So looking at ways in which we are restricting armed officers from responding to crimes on the street, and less than 1% of calls to the police across the country are violent crimes. So we know we don't need armed officers in the streets. So scaling those armed officers back and expanding and investing a workforce that actually does comprehensive conflict resolution. So that means employing and building a workforce that includes social workers, folks who are trained in mental health and substance abuse efforts, especially those in our ward. We have 2 university campuses with Augsburg and the U of M. So we have students who are coming out in debt and are trained in this work. Let's give them the space to show up for our communities when they're in crisis. So we're looking at completely redefining what public safety means, especially with the charter campaigns that are happening, that's going to place the police under the direct leadership of city council and away from our mayor. The last piece, which we call for, is tax the rich, because we know that public safety is an intersectional aspect, like housing is part of public safety. When we have neighbors who are being forced out of their communities, forced out of their homes because of lack of affordability, that's a problem. And time again, we've outsourced that problem to corporate developers who only want to see profits increase through rising rents. So this is why we're saying tax the rich. That means fining corporate developers so that we can have revenue to create our own publicly owned housing, and also expanding that to include public housing as well. That means buying back apartment units from the market as well, so that we're keeping housing in our communities and not forcing people out. But we have to tax the rich to do so. That also means around all our major infrastructure regarding transportation, even environmental justice requires us to expand the abundance of resources that we have in our city. And so that it doesn't come on the backs of working class people who are already financially constrained, especially in light of our COVID pandemic. So we want to go after the folks who profits off of our labor and amass wealth at our expense. So we want to make sure that we're going after the Fortune 500 companies, and we have the largest concentration here in the Twin Cities in the country of Fortune 500 companies. We want to go after them and get that money that we generate back into our community so that we can fully fund these measures that keeps our community whole, well, and safe. So those are the things that we don't see many other candidates or even our incumbents are raising and looking to build with coalitions of working class people to really address these core inequities that plagues our city time and time again. So those are some of the things that we intend on fighting for, and we're actively fighting for in this moment.
Thank you. The next question that I have is, uh, uh, what would you like to see done with the site of the former 3rd Police Precinct in Minneapolis?
Yeah, and I should note that back in the fall, I joined many of our Longfellow and Seward neighbors, particularly after an event that our current incumbent Cam Gordon had, where they were ready to vote to allocate $5 million towards the relocation and rebuilding of that 3rd precinct. Without any democratic input from the communities. Also, with this happening within, less than 3 months of George Floyd being tortured and killed by MPD officers. So we organized after Cam Gordon's event with a variety of community groups to block that relocation of the precinct and to block the $5 million that was going to basically support policing as it exists in our communities. And one of our key demands from that protest was we need a community engagement process that will allow our neighbors to decide what does it look like for the 3rd precinct to even re-enter into our communities and to also reassess what type of community safety alternatives can we pursue instead of officers patrolling our streets armed and doing the same things that produced, the murders of George Floyd and Jamar Clark. And those calls, those demands were not taken up by our incumbent, nor were they taken up by city council. So for our campaign, we're still leading with that. When we're talking about public safety beyond policing, we want our neighbors to have a direct role in deciding what does it look like to change what it means to be a public safety servant. And to do that, that means we need to be shifting how we think of public safety. Again, that site could be a space, and we proposed that when we fought for blocking it. Could we have restorative justice coordinators be housed in that site? We worked with the Seward Longfellow Restorative Justice Organization. They said that they're willing to get staff and volunteers to help respond to community crises that we know are likely not needing of armed officers. Can we use that building for that? We have folks who are tending to our unsheltered residents saying, look, can we be part of sharing that space so that we can tend to our unsheltered residents who are finding refuge in our parks like Matthews Park, Brackett Park? Can we use that site to actually provide the resources needed to address these conflict and crises that we know MPD is not trained nor designed to tend to? And those are the things that were reflected even in the people's budget, which my campaign had a direct role and supported, the only candidate that supported the people's budget, which was co-created by more than 60 community groups across the city, where we were looking how we can actually overhaul and transform public safety to make it meaningful for our communities. And we include proposals like that none of our city council members took up. They decided to move forward with Safety for All that ignored those robust proposals that were created by the community in the people's budget. So I think for us, it's starting there. I have no intentions of bringing back policing into our ward as it currently stands. And we support the same demand that we raised there of community input, and making sure that we're looking at alternative responses. We're investing in the alternative responses that actually get at the core reasons why our communities are not safe for everyone.
Thank you. And yeah, if folks want to start putting their questions in the Q&A box, I'm going to ask one last question from our cache of questions, although there's some additional ones that I may ask if the pace of the questions from the audience slackens a little bit. But this one is, who are some current elected officials, locally or nationally, who you would like to model your leadership off of, and why?
I think as democratic socialists, immediately those that come to mind is Bernie Sanders. Again, like as an organizer, that was my entryway into organizing in the Twin Cities, was around the Fight for 15 campaign that, Bernie Sanders helped to create a national platform and movement behind. So I think definitely Bernie Sanders is one of the core folks that I'm looking at. Another one is Cori Bush from Ferguson. Just knowing my own roots of, coupled with the Fight for 15 campaign that really brought me into organizing. Prior to that, actually at the same time, it was the murder of Jamar Clark by our Minneapolis Police Department. And we had this growing Black Lives Matter movement, coupled with this rising workers' rights movement that was being led by hourly Black and brown workers, who are all saying the same thing, that the way in which we prioritize and organize our city is all for the sake of profits, and it's at the expense of working class people and Black and brown communities. And until we invest in things like quality unionized jobs, housing, we're not going to have safe communities. As long as we keep investing in racist systems of policing, we're going to keep having these murders happen in our communities. And those are the same movements that gave birth to even Cori Bush, who was out on the front lines in Ferguson and has stayed true to, throughout her pathway from being on the streets to now being a congresswoman, that we cannot use these political resources or capital that our communities have won through their organizing, through movement building, towards investing in the protection and preservation of policing as it stands. So Cori Bush is definitely someone who is like my shero. Nina Simone, who's also running, as someone who's been amazing education champion. As many know, I work for the statewide teachers union, and also I see public education as being part of efforts to keep our community safe. When we divest in public education and instead invest in prisons based off of third graders' test scores, that's a problem. Again, showing that our priorities needs to be shifted to the collective well-being of our communities. And locally, I will say that, as an elected leader, I'm committed to working with anyone that are grounded in the issues of making sure we're taxing the rich, we're creating mandates for universalizing housing, and making sure that we are moving public safety beyond racist systems of policing that, again, produces Daunte Wright, Ma'Khia Bryant, who was just murdered in Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio. Like, I'm invested in working with leaders who are grounded in making those issues, those proposals a reality, because it's so necessary. We just literally had a week where our state was ready to go to war with ordinary people and civilians, and showed that they would rather back a police state that harms and traumatizes our communities time and time again. And the Chauvin conviction was the state trying to save itself. So we are in a historic moment where our movement should not be letting off steam, and we need to be holding every elected leader feet to the fire to make sure that just for every one of Chauvin's, we are getting rid of the 50 to 100 that still exists on the workforce, that are still exist within our public safety system, and making sure that they never get a chance to police our communities again.
Thank you, Robin. We have a couple of questions coming in, so I encourage folks to continue to put those in. One is, would you support a city resolution calling upon the Biden administration to end the U.S. embargo against Cuba?
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, Biden is an extension of imperialism that every presidential candidate has backed, because we are an imperialist nation. And we, just as the socialist struggles, especially those led by Black and brown folks. I'm thinking Fred Hampton's, from Chicago, South Side Chicago, my own hometown. The state, our own state, launched a attack on him for simply organizing ordinary working class people to understand their shared realities. And that was a threat to the state, specifically a capitalist state. So they orchestrated the wide-scale attack and assassinations and incarcerations of Black Panther leaders, as well as civil rights movement leaders, for the sake of preserving itself, its imperialist and exploitative relationships to everyone in the world. Again, around the sake of preserving profits, for the sake of preserving the interests of the corporate elites. And the way in which our country has responded to Cuba is grounded in that. Cuba has forged a independent political terrain and economic infrastructure that is grounded in the collective public good. And that will forever be a threat to the capitalist, in charge United States of America. And the ways in which we go after them is leveraging sanctions, interfering with their ability to get access to goods that are needed for their people. We even saw it with the COVID pandemic, where they were trying to sanction what type of COVID vaccinations could be sent to, countries like Cuba. And that's an intentional way of a threat. So I definitely would support and getting city council members to show that, the efforts that's happening against Cuba, we leverage those time and time again amongst our own civilians domestically. Again, and showing that we did that even recently with Dante Wright. And this is a time where we need to be modeling, looking at Cuba as a way in which we need to rearrange our city. Rethink how we're providing housing, how we're providing healthcare to meet the public good. So I definitely would support a resolution and lead the charge on making that happen.
Okay, thank you. We have another question submitted via the Q&A box, which asks, are you a landlord? Do you own one or more investment properties with tenants?
Nope, I'm a broke ass renter. I live in a development called Luna Properties that were created right in Cedar Riverside, thanks to the fruits of the 2040 plan, where it's about 100 units in this property. In this new development. And the average, our rent for a 2-bedroom shoebox is about $2,000 market rate. So we are also part of the renters in our ward that are living in cost burdened housing, where more than 30% of our income is going towards rent alone. So when I'm advocating for rent control as well, is based off of, I understand if it wasn't for me and my husband having 2 incomes, I could also be on the, and actually we are, if one of us were to lose our jobs, we will also be in the position of many of our residents and neighbors who are undergoing eviction proceedings because they've lost income and can't pay, they high ass rents. So no, I do not own investment properties, no, nor do I ever intend to. And I think every renter deserves to live in housing that they can afford. It should not be priced out of their communities. And that's why I support the measures around rent control and TOPA, so we can keep folks in our communities.
Okay, and we have a question, a long one. I'm going to try and summarize it a little bit, but that you mentioned in your questionnaire that you had been involved with Defend Glendale and Public Housing Coalition, and so would like to hear more about kind of the nature of your organizing with these groups and kind of your relationship with them.
Um, there's two prone. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a University of Minnesota student, PhD student, and part of my tenure as a PhD student, I've supported a number of research projects, specifically with the Center for Urban Regional Planning, CURA. And recently we did a study on public housing that was actually co-led and co-created with Black women, Black and brown women. No, actually, it was just Black women who have either been in public housing, displaced by public housing, and we included in our analysis, again, efforts like RAT, for instance, how that's being utilized to destroy and minimize the lot of public housing that we have and to privatize it. And that also includes our public housing that in Ward 2, which is the Glendale townhomes, and looking at ways in which residents have been pushing back against that. In many, of these cases, a lot of folks are afraid to organize against their landlords, whereas in Glendale, residents was lighting it up. They organized and formed Defend Glendale to push back on these privatization efforts. So through my research, I've amplified those community-led efforts to protect public housing. Also, we've supported the rent control and TOPA efforts that's been led by the Public Housing for All Coalition that includes groups like Defend Glendale, Incolinix, Zaka. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that name right. There's a whole host of housing advocacy groups that are pushing back on, again, the market-based housing that we continue to pour money into and see no fruits from. So we've been actively, supporting, including in our door knocks, that ask for rent control, that ask for TOPA, and also in our future events, making sure that we have folks in the leadership of our campaign who are public housing residents. So, one of our key things is to bring on an organizer that's going to be working with our East African communities and those living in cost burden or vulnerable housing. So that means like our students, that means like our folks in Glendale homes, townhomes. So we are making sure that, again, we're not just waiting until the election to support these community grassroots efforts around housing, like we're actively supporting ways that we can with the work that they're leading in our communities.
Thank you. So we are currently, the Q&A queue is open. So encourage folks to continue to submit questions as you can think of them, and make sure that you get those in there. Robin, you've mentioned rent and housing and rent control a number of times. We had a question submitted about how would you support citywide rent control as a city council member?
So by then, by November, we would have built a successful movement to get it on the ballot and hopefully vote. The voting piece of is only one part of that. And I think the next phase of that is then again building up a robust movement, because we're already seeing corporate developer alliances forming to push back against rent control. And it's being similar to like the Fight for 15. We had the Pathway to 15, which were all like the corporate businesses organizing small minority owned businesses to say, look, this is going to like make a ghost town and the world is going to fall apart. We're seeing the same developments play out on the ground. These corporate developers are trying to organize small scale landlords to say like, look, they're coming for your properties. They're coming for you. So it's going to take building a robust and multiracial movement. And I think our role as elected officials can be pivotal in that, making sure we're doing continuous town halls and forums. And one of the pieces that we address in our questionnaire is having a community office outside of City Hall, and that being a hub of organizing, because I'm going in with my organizing experience. So it's one thing to do town halls and forums, to engage the general public around this. And we did that actually in January, where we brought leaders from the Minneapolis United Rent Control Coalition to do a public forum around what does it look like to build a strong movement to pass rent control. We will continue those efforts through our community office and continue to activate our neighbors and supporters in doing door knocks throughout our ward, in coordination with that coalition to do citywide door knocks, phone banks, petition drives, building that popular mandate so that an ordinance could then be passed. Because we're going to anticipate, and we should be anticipating, like even Jacob Fry has recently mentioned, he would veto a charter proposal, but he much prefer the rent control process going through city council, because that way he could bring in his corporate developer goonies to come in and create loopholes and to weaken that policy. So we're going to have mass support and an organized, united front to push back against there, to make sure that we don't have no cutbacks, no loopholes, just like what we did with the Fight for 15, so that we can actually have a rent control measure that addresses tenants' needs in the city and keep them housed, and making sure that they have extra disposable income after they pay rent that goes beyond just covering basic necessities. So those are the things that we plan to do, as elected leaders, and see our roles in helping strengthen and build that movement citywide to make sure rent control happens, and making sure it's a strong policy or strong ordinance that gets passed.
Gotcha. We have a question, basically, how would you basically bring the movement into city council?
One way, as I mentioned just now, is that community office. We realize that City Hall is not a space where ordinary people feel empowered nor see themselves and their needs reflected. And we want to make sure we have a hub where community groups feel kind of like the Workers' Rights Center over by George Floyd Square, where community groups can gather and organize around the key issues impacting, ordinary people in Black and Brown communities and workers and students. So we want to make sure we have that office so that, and have staff. And this is one of the things, my campaign team has pledged that we would donate, portions of our income to fund that office, to provide, staffing opportunities to students, so that we have the infrastructure needed to organize, again, these door knock campaigns, these text or phone banks around these critical issues that we're campaigning for, so they don't just stay on the campaign trail. So that's one big piece of it. And again, staying rooted in our social movements. It makes me think of, this past winter, where we had, again, the people's budget, community groups and neighbors organizing around that. I thought of what would it look like to have at least one or two council members saying, this is our ordinance right here that we're going to introduce. This powerful, comprehensive, expansive proposal that was created by our very own, neighbors, around how we can address public safety. We had not one that took that up. They decided to go with a milquetoast version and decide to pursue safety for all. That actually did little to honor their pledges, last June, to defund the police. When it comes out, there was about 1 million that were actually transitioned out of the police department, and it was largely due to them cutting back on the horse budget, the horses that they send out to, like, with police officers to terrorize the community. So I think of that too, of like, if we had council members that instead, worked in partnership when it comes to issues like public safety and housing, and work in partnership with the groups that are organizing on the ground, instead of fearing, instead of dismissing them. Like, the progress that we could have. That happened with 15. You know, for 4 years, we organized around that issue. We met with council members, and they, you know, several of them, even my incumbent, Cam Gordon, all of them, you know, said that they supported it. But no one took the leadership to introduce an ordinance out of fear, out of not wanting to exercise the political courage because they feared the response from, you know, the corporations in our city. So out of that fear, it forced ordinary workers, you know, Black and brown workers, to miss time with their families to go do strike actions and walkouts. We did this for, you know, over 4 years. And to do a charter process, so we got 20,000 signatures to put it on the ballot, only for, you know, the charter commission to strike it down, and then for city council to also democratically strike it down. And then we had to sue city council and take it to the Supreme Court. And all that time, we're like, you could have introduced the ordinance, and no one did. And it took, after all of that, after we built a robust, you know, mass mandate that every worker deserves at least $30,000 a year in this city, that actually warrants you to make way more to stay here and have a quality of life. It took all of that for city council to finally pass an ordinance. And it's just like, you have 4 years to take that leadership. Any one of you who offered support passively does nothing to advance the gains and needs of our movements on ordinary people. And I think that is what we're proposing with our campaign, to be in the front lines, on the front lines with our movements, championing those proposals, building movements around them, getting, you know, our neighbors invited into building this process, building these coalitions, so that we can expedite those gains instead of having to do this jump through hoops of fire in order to finally get city council members who are passively supportive of these things behind us. So we're prepared to interrupt that process.
Well, thank you. We've got another question from the same questioner who asked that last one. I'm going to skip that for now, but we'll get back to it. The next one in the queue is, in the nonpartisan Minneapolis election, you've decided to run as an independent. Are you willing to vocally endorse future TC-DSA endorsed socialists who have chosen, for various reasons, to run for the DFL ballot line?
We have no issues with supporting fellow, you know, democratic socialists, especially those that are supporting I think the issues that we're committed to, and that is very reflective of like DSA's political platform. And I think we're going to keep it to like the issues. We want to see elected officials that are committed to the issues in the platform, as that being the grounds of endorsement. And I say this because we also make it very clear, you know, as independents, that we want to offer critical support to those candidates as well. Like, we don't want to endorse candidates that are seeing elections as a stepping stone for their careers. And that has been something that has happened even in Chicago, you know, with their Democratic caucus, a socialist caucus. And we don't want to be here to provide political cover to candidates who have no interest in actually building the movements around, you know, socialist values and our platforms that we're building with ordinary people. And for those that we do support, we also want to be clear that it's critical support. And any time that you back away from the mandates that ordinary people have deemed to be important, that necessary, we will call you out on that. Similar to like, we will not, again, be here to provide that political cover. We will say, if you supported rent control throughout your campaign, and then you get elected and you say, maybe we should take a listen to Blackstone, you know, no, that's a problem. And we will not be here being like, no, no, we're calling that out. You need to get back in line with our members in the Twin Cities DSA. You need to do some coming to Jesus with meetings with them to get back online, or whatever the case may be. But we will call that out. So I think that is a fine line that we want to walk, in making sure that, again, if we are supporting candidates, it's based in the issues. It's based in their records of being in partnership, in, organizing on the ground with our community partners, and not giving political cover to folks who have different, political intentions.
Thank you. Have a question. What are your thoughts on the future of the Blue Line extension?
The Blue Line extension has been for years. I see it on par with even the Upper Harbor Terminal, because they're all in the same areas and it's impacting a historically Black community. And often was that particular planning never involved democratic input from the community members that it will most impact. And it's very clear that the city is moving forward with it. And I think, similar to, again, the Upper Harbor Terminal, we will support in organizing and elevating, elevating how our neighbors, in the area where that extension will be created, especially those who will disproportionately be impacted by it. Like, what do they want to see happen with it? One of the things we mentioned in our questionnaire, even for the Upper Harbor Terminal, is we will be huge proponents of creating community agreements that's supposed to lay out, the shared interests that developments need to meet, especially in vulnerable or disenfranchised communities. And I think that is something that community members over North need to be activated in. How is this going to create, a pipeline of jobs directly for their communities during the development of it and afterwards? How are we using revenue that's generated by this extension to directly invest back into those communities through housing, the expansion or purchasing of public housing? There's also a land trust over there. So that the City of Lakes Land Trust. So even thinking of ways to support, getting more homes, using revenue to get more homes into that particular land trust. So, our neighbors over there won't be priced out of their communities when it's built and it's not actually used to successfully gentrify those areas. So I think those are some of the things that needs to be organized around, and the community has been for years saying how. I'm thinking of the Harrison Neighborhood Association. They have had a number of organizers dedicated to building community, input into that process. And I think with tools like community agreements, again, using our office in partnership with the groups that are organizing over there to look at how are we looking at revenue, how to actually support the needs of that community, if it's in housing, if it's investing in the schools over there. Because again, all this is intersectional. Like, we have this freaking CDD plan that's putting schools primarily over north under the threat of closure, and busing those students all the way over south in order to have a quality of education. And I think this is an opportunity to say, again, revenue to keep our community safe, to make sure they can also, have equitable access to transportation in their communities and not have to be bused all the way across the city that adds to carbon emissions to have a quality education. They should be able to afford to live in their communities, find free or affordable transportation to move around in their communities. Like, those are key things that I think is very intersectional, and that our office can play a pivotal role in coordinating.
Thank you. So we're at the 10-minute warning. So I'm gonna, ask folks, get your questions in quick. So we had a question about asking if you could expand upon your background in transformative justice and why healing is an important element of the campaign.
Yep. So prior to moving to Minneapolis, I did a Thomas J. Watson fellowship where I traveled to a number of countries looking at how they were responding to growing incarceration rates, because I thought one of those countries will have the golden nugget that I could bring back to the US, me alone, could bring back to the US and be like, this is it. We can do all the change. We can end all the prisons and don't have to lock up brown and black people anymore. And that was grounded in, as I mentioned earlier, my own lived experience growing up in Chicago and having loved ones, spend decades of their lives in and out of our prisons, like growing up from the age of 1, spending my weekends going to visit loved ones in prisons and being like, no family should ever have to go through that. And unfortunately, it's mostly working class Black families that do have to expend, resources and time to constantly supporting loved ones who are targeted and routed into our criminal justice system time and time again. So I was like, I want to solve this. And in the process of doing my research, I came across some of the work around restorative justice, specifically in South Africa, and how they were using that model to address violent crimes around murder, around sexual assault. And it really sparked my interest because, criminal justice, especially in the US, is very, punitive. We want to make sure we punish you and punish you hard, but we never punish the actual right people. Like, you never punish the CEO, Jeff Bezos, for like enacting tons of harm and just like inequities, but neither here nor there. We want to punish you. So coming and moving to Minneapolis, I had the opportunity to connect and get on the board of a restorative justice organization called Restorative Justice Community Action. And while there, I became trained in restorative justice circle keeping, community conferencing. We also, most of our services was doing similar things to the Stewart Longfellow Restorative Justice organization here in the ward, well, next to the ward, where we were providing, alternatives to our criminal justice system to people who typically that's your only option. So we were providing, circle keeping circles and community conferences to Black and brown youth, especially around transportation in St. Paul, that was being used to criminalize Black and brown youth back about 4 years ago. And to expand it to include people who had felonies as well, or had been charged with felonies. So that was an eye opener for me in terms of like the restorative justice work. But also in Minnesota, this is kind of when I made my transition over to transformative justice. There was a point in the restorative justice movement in Minneapolis where it became very co-opted around whiteness and very indifferent to power structures. And I recall this in one of the circles that I was participating in, where it was an East African man who had been charged with a felony for apparently interpreting an officer who was undercover as a sex worker. And the thing is, the man spoke limited English, and essentially it was a setup. The officer approached their car and was offering, sexual services, and this East African gentleman did not understand like what was happening. And instead of like addressing that in that circle, it was like, and the onus is on you. Like, and we're saying this to his translator, like, you need to make this right. If not, you could go to jail. And I was like, wait, are we not going to address like the entrapment of this? And there's been a whole reckoning within the restorative justice movement around like it pacifies victims also who are subjected to police violence in our communities. And transformative justice is really about grounding it in a power analysis and knowing that we shouldn't provide these to victims. We should be using, tools like restorative justice to really push back on these injustices, to make sure that we are creating, interruptions in our policing practices of our communities and ending them, especially like across all offenses. We should not be just going to punitive solutions alone. And I think that's where kind of I've made that transition after those cases, but I still continue to support circle keeping work, especially in our schools. I supported the campaign to get restorative justice practices integrated in our public schools in Minneapolis and St. Paul, making sure our educators are trained up in circle keeping so they're not using student resource officers to come in and intervene and criminalize students when they can resolve those conflicts themselves. And again, making this about power. Like, as an educator, you have the power to alter a student life for forever by sending them into the hands of that SRO. Whereas opposed, like, you also have the opportunity to keep them in the student community, make sure that, yes, they learn a lesson, experience accountability in a way that doesn't make them feel less than, makes them feel like their humanity is questioned. So that's some of my work. And that's why I'm also committed to like working with restorative justice organizations as we build this new, apparatus of public safety that does honor everyone's, full rights, human rights, basic needs as well.
Okay, so the last question of the evening, you mentioned in the questionnaire a couple times the idea of if you're endorsed, setting up some sort of memorandum of understanding or MOU. Could you expand a little bit more about kind of what this might entail, or and what the what your kind of vision is for that?
Yes, and that directly comes from my labor background. MOUs are usually created between a union and the employer to outline, shared values as well as the activities that they will organize and work together on to make sure those values are upheld. And we really want to bring this into our campaign with all the organizations that endorse us, because we hear time and time again, we endorse, these candidates, they get into office and we can't never hear from them. And they're like supporting, issues and proposals and legislation that completely conflicts with our values. And yet we still can't hold them accountable. So this MOU, we feel like, gives the opportunity for our campaign and TCDSA members to outline, okay, we know that, yes, like rent control is a shared value of both of ours. What does it look like to work together, throughout this campaign once we're in office? Like, how are we working together around that? Are we doing monthly, meetings? I mentioned with our community office, are we doing monthly, like joint door knocks, co-hosted events to make sure that we're building that sustained movement around rent control, across the city? It can also, look like in terms of internal accountability, we will at our campaign or our office will meet monthly or bi-weekly with the different branches of DSA so that we can stay up to date on some of the key issues that they're organizing around. So like in labor branch, in our housing branch, like it could look like that. So I think it's those pieces of, setting ground rules for how both of us will be accountable to one another, and also setting like what are we going to build together as, we support these shared issues, these shared proposals. How are we doing that, as a team? So that is kind of our thinking behind that MOU and why we really want to do that. So no one can ever be like, when we're in office, we're like, I never got in touch. Or again, like we're saying in Chicago, avoid that dynamic where it's just like, wait, you supported this. I thought you supported X instead. And it's just like, no, let's hash that out. And we already hashed that out because on our MOU, we're meeting bi-weekly to plan how we're going to approach this upcoming, committee meeting on rent control. So like, it's for us also just an organizing tool with those who also support our vision, and share a shared, values around these things and making socialism happen in our communities.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Robin, for joining us. It is 7 o'clock, so we'll end the session. Really appreciate you being available to answer member questions, taking up time out of your day. Want to remind all of the DSA members that we're going to be posting this recording, I believe, in the wiki so that it's available for TCDSA members. And so if there are any of your comrades who weren't able to make it, they'll have a place to check it out and hear from Robin. And as always, discussion continues in the electoral channel on Slack. So encourage folks to go there and continue the discussion. And also to remind folks that we have additional Q&A conference calls most of the days of the next week or so. So encourage folks to tune in to as many of those as they can. Continue to ask your questions both during the sessions and also to submit questions online. So with that, I will thank everyone for coming out and have a lovely rest of your evening.